Thanks very much for coming to our final Students Talk back lunch of the fall semester. For those of you who I haven't met yet this semester, my name is Dan Schnur, and I'm the Executive Director of the Unruh Institute of Politics here at USC. And we co-sponsor these lunches every 2 weeks with the USC College Democrats, the USC College Republicans, and with our friends at the Daily Trojan. And as is the case every time we do a Students Talk back, I get to co-moderate this panel along with one of the DT's editors. And today we're really, really lucky to be joined by the news editor of the Daily Trojan, Anshu Siripurapu. Anshu, thank you very much for coming, and thanks to you and all your colleagues at the DT for all the work you do for us. Thank you. We've got a great panel discussion today. We're going to talk about the outcomes of last night's elections. I know some of you joined us last night for the election watch when we were talking about the results as they came in, but haven't had a little bit of time overnight to digest those results and to get a sense not only on who won and who lost, but what that means going forward. I think is going to make today's discussion a really, really interesting and a really, really important one. So let me take just a quick minute to introduce our panelists, and then we'll get started with the conversation. First of all, as most of you know, sitting at the far, far end of the table is our friend and our legislative fellow, Anthony Portantino. Anthony, as most of you know, served in the California State Assembly, but now it's our good fortune to have him here at USC. First as a legislator in residence and now as an adjunct instructor. Anthony, thanks very much for joining us today. It's okay to clap for him, by the way. I guess the students from your classes weren't really serious about that class participation grade anyway. Okay. Most of you have had a chance to meet Anthony over the course of not only this semester, but his previous year here on campus. But our next panelist is someone who you might not yet know, but someone who you're definitely going to benefit from getting to know. Sitting right here in the middle of the table is my old friend, Tony Russo. And Tony is a partner in the firm of Russo, Miller & Associates, Public Affairs in Sacramento. He's the former Group Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs for the Irvine Company in Orange County. And he's a former partner at McNally Temple & Associates, but generally is recognized as one of the smartest people in California politics, particularly on behalf of Republican causes and business and job creating interests. Tony is also a graduate of the University of Southern California, class of 2011. Is that right, Tony?
I wish.
Okay. Tony, welcome back to campus. We're thrilled to have you here. And last but certainly not least, as you know, we make a practice, it's actually a rule for these programs, that we're not just going to have off-campus experts, but students experts as well participating in and leading this conversation. And so we're really, really lucky today to have both Jordan Tygh, the Vice President of the USC College Republicans, and Alec White, the President of the SC College Democrats. Jordan, Alec, we're really glad you guys are here. Thanks very much. Okay, so I think you're going to ask the first question. Aren't you, Anshu?
Sure.
Absolutely.
So my first question, directed to Alec, actually.
Well, one thing about California is that in both 2010, 2012, and 2014, we did a lot better than many Democrats around the nation. In 2014, we did lose a couple of assembly seats and a couple of Senate seats in the state Senate. But still, we definitely say we did a lot better than we did in other places like New York, where Democrats lost on about 4 congressional seats. So what makes it such a strong Democratic state, and we've been able to weather Republican waves like 2010 and 2014. And I think a lot of it is our base, because California's a really strong Democratic base. Other states don't have as strong turnout organization as we do, and we've been really successful at turning out our voters. And also, I think a lot of it has to do with how Jerry Brown has been as a governor, at least for 2014, because a lot of the other states where Democrats didn't do as well were facing poor governorship and poor Democratic candidates, but at the same time, Jerry Brown having a very successful career as a California governor, at least in the eyes of most Californians, and got reelected pretty soundly, and looking to win all the statewide races. And I think Jerry Brown's presence at the top of the ticket definitely helped a lot. At the same time, the combination of California as a turn operation, and I also think we've been having a strong Democratic trend for a while. And while I thought I was going to be like, a straight line towards the Democrats, it's going to be more jagged, but it's always going to be more in an upward direction because of our changing demographics at the same time. So pretty much those 3 reasons.
Thanks so much. So Jordan, my next question. So no, obviously, sorry, thank you. Governor Jerry Brown was just reelected to his 4th term in office, but I'm wondering what we can take away from the campaign of his opponent, Neel Kashkari.
Yeah, I think, back in the primary, Karl Rove said that Neel Kashkari would be the perfect candidate to lose to Jerry Brown. Let me take this. And I think he was right, because his opponent, Tim Donnelly, was much more abrasive and much more aggressive and came across as angry. I think, and the top of the ticket really helps lower races. So I think if we saw Tim Donnelly on the top of the ticket, I don't think we would have seen as much success in the party here in California. We had congressional gains, we had state Senate gains, and we also had state assembly gains. I don't think we got to 1/3 in the assembly. I think we might have got to 1/3 in the assembly, and we stopped the supermajority in the Senate. And I think his candidacy really helped that. He could speak to a wider range of people. He was a new kind of candidate. He did very non-traditional things. He was clearly not going to win, but I think his candidacy really helped state legislative, Senate races, and congressional races.
Jordan, thanks very much. I want to bring Tony into this conversation now. Tony, obviously a governor's race is going to get a great deal more attention just on the natural. And while Neel Kashkari may have laid the groundwork for Republican gains in the future, it never really appeared to be a very competitive race. But in your line of work, I know you pay a great deal of attention to the legislative campaigns as well, the campaigns for state assembly and state senate. Maybe you can take a minute to talk a little bit about what you saw from last night's results in the legislature, and also maybe just give a minute explanation on why these races, even though so much lower profile, are so important.
So let me start sort of by answering the tail end of that question first. The reason these races are critical in California is the ability to raise taxes in the legislature is built on a 2/3 vote. So the last 2 years, Democrats have had a supermajority. They could raise taxes if they wanted to. The governor hasn't wanted to. After Prop 30 said we weren't going to raise taxes again. The unions in the state do want to raise taxes. In fact, we've seen different reports that the public employee unions want to raise $21 billion in taxes over the next 4 years. And I can go later into a discussion or Q&A over where and how. But the legislative races are key because they are a check on that sort of unfettered ability by the supermajority to do just about anything they want. And so if you look at the legislative races, that's really where the focus was for Republican donors in this election. All the Republican candidates statewide were pitifully funded, if at all. Kashkari was a great candidate. He fit the mold of who needs to rebrand the Republican Party in California if we're going to have any appeal to Latinos and younger voters and moderates and women. But from a donor perspective, nobody believed Jerry Brown could be beat. So he lacked funding and he had an inability to put his message out. All the focus really was on legislative races, and the goal was to win back 1/3. The Senate was a very clear path to do that. We had to hold a Senate seat in the Central Valley, and we had to pick up a Senate seat in Orange County, which we did, and those races were fully funded to the tune of about $4 million each. In the Assembly, the path was not so clear. So there were 2 Democrat incumbents who won seats in 2012, which was a historic turnout for Democrats with the presidential year. They probably should have never won those seats, North Orange County and the High Desert, and Republicans won those seats back this year. They won them back handily. The key was, where would you pick up the 3rd and necessary seat to get 1/3? And there really weren't many places to go. And this is where I would say, rarely do we see this in California, but we saw a little bit of a wave. Not a big enough wave to overcome the demographic trends and the voter registration trends from a statewide perspective, but in isolated, targeted districts, there was a wave. And to put it in perspective, I think that wave was possible only because of turnout. To put turnout in perspective, in 2010, the last gubernatorial election, Meg Whitman against Jerry Brown, turnout was 58%. Turnout in yesterday's election, we're going to be lucky if it breaks into the low 30s. So when you change the nature of who's voting, you change the outcome of those elections. And in this case, Democrats really had no reason to vote. Jerry Brown was never threatened. None of the statewide candidates were really threatened. And so if you're a Democrat turned off maybe a little bit by the president's policies in Washington, not excited or compelled about anything that's going to change in California, you don't vote. And that's, I think, what we saw happen.
Right. Thanks very much, Tony. Anthony Portantino, in just a minute, we're going to move on to a conversation about the national outcomes last night. But before we do, let's shift our attention to the statewide level from what happened last night to what it means going forward. Tony was talking about the Republican gains in the legislature, leaving the Democrats just shy of a 2/3 majority in the Senate, and that margin in the Assembly still probably unclear. What does that mean? For Jerry Brown's next 4 years as governor, what does it mean? What's the difference between having a 2/3 majority and not attaining it? What should we look for going forward?
I think that's the key in California. In addition to needing 2/3 to raise taxes, you also need 2/3 to put an initiative on the ballot. For the Democrats, life is easy when you have a supermajority in both houses and you have a Democratic governor, because you can just have your will become law in essence. And what we saw, as Tony talked about, is the Republican donor base focusing on those, half a dozen swing districts in California to try to bring a little check and balance into that Democratic supermajority that we saw over the last 2 years. I think the other significant piece is in a number of Democrat on Democratic races, top two, we had same party members running against each other in the general. You saw some moderate Democrats beat some progressive Democrats. And I think that too will have an impact on the Democratic caucuses in the two houses. And so with two new Democratic leaders, we have a new speaker, we have a new Senate pro tem, and with supermajority right on the edge, and a governor who has shown his lack of interest in raising taxes. I think there's going to be some interesting conversations within the progressive community, within the left, of how to move forward with new moderates and with less of a supermajority. And obviously in one house, no supermajority. So I think it's going to be an interesting time for Democrats in power, because even though they are in power, there's a pause for cause. And I think it's going to say a lot about the new leaders, who I think are both terrific in their, were selected by their caucus. I think they're up to the challenge, but there's certainly going to be, and I think potentially a healthy conversation. When you have to stop and think about what you're going to do, typically you make a better decision than when you don't have to stop and think about it. And so I think the left will be better served by the conversation, because there's still enough votes to make things happen. But I think there's going to be a more pragmatic approach to moving forward out of necessity, and I think that might shift to better decisions.
Okay, so I think at this point I'd like to kind of shift the conversation away from the state level and towards the national level. I think we can start with Anthony again, if you don't mind, and then we can maybe get a follow-up from Tony and their two students. What can we, now that the Republicans control both houses of the national legislature, what can we expect to see coming out of that?
I think there's two interesting things from the national picture. Obviously, it's the most significant Republican majority of the House since World War II. No one could argue that there was a wave of support nationally that elected many Republicans in blue states. You saw blue governors lose to red governors. And so I think there's two things. A, will there be restraint on the new Republican majority to respond to the overwhelming call from the general public of wanting a bipartisan solution, wanting cooperation, ending the gridlock. I think, poll after poll after poll said people want things to get done. And so will the Republicans and the president respond to that desire and have some bipartisan solutions, or will the Republican majority say, we won, we're going to do it our way, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead? And then I think the more pragmatic Republicans are going to be looking at the White House. How does the events of last night position a Republican presidential candidate to win the presidency, and whether pragmatism and bipartisanship help create a path for success, or whether ideology and arrogance overplay their hand. And I watched an interview with Chris Christie this morning, and people were talking about his tie. He wore a pink tie. And they were saying, oh, you're softening your image because you helped turn the blue state governors to red state governors, and you're now positioned to be the standard bearer. And then, Paul is out there. Everybody's taking credit on the Republican side for the sweep to position themselves for the White House. So to me, the question is, do the pragmatic Republicans look at the White House, or do the ideological Republicans look for an agenda? And time will tell.
Tony, would you like to follow up with that?
Yeah, I agree with that perspective. I think it's interesting if you look at the sweep Republicans had in Congress back in 2010, it was all led by the Tea Party. And so it was very right-wing, it was very hard, it didn't want to compromise, it wasn't pragmatic, and it sort of defined the 2012 election in a way that wasn't helpful to Republicans. In the same way, Republicans can't let that happen, or it's going to define the presidential campaign, just like Anthony described. I don't know if any of you saw it, but from California we have Congressman Kevin McCarthy. He was a very talented, very moderate Republican leader of the state assembly, went to Congress, became a whip quickly. He's now the majority leader. Setting the agenda for the House will be his charge. And he's already said that our responsibility as Republicans, now in the majority in the House and the Senate, is to prove that Republicans can govern. And that means being somewhat bipartisan. It also means putting reasonable policies on the president's desk and either encouraging him to sign them or forcing him to veto them and let him define the partisan nature of Washington. So I think we're going to see the House and the Senate put a budget on the president's desk. I think we're going to see tax reform. I think we're going to see regulatory relief. And we're going to see it all guised in the notion of creating jobs. And then if we do that well, then I think the presidential campaigns will be well positioned for Republicans going into 2016. One other observation I would suggest, that there are different Republicans just like there are different Democrats. So you've got sort of chamber, moderate-oriented Republicans, you've got Tea Party Republicans, like you pointed out, you've got libertarian-type Republicans. There was a huge effort in the primary, both by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and by American Crossroads, to not let the Tea Party dominate the Republican nominees in the November election. And they played in numerous primaries and defeated Tea Party candidates almost universally. And so I think you're going to see there's also a big effort from groups outside of the party to instill some discipline on the party to actually govern well.
Tony, thanks very much. I'm going to come to Jordan now. Jordan, Tony's outlined a couple of areas where he thinks the potential for some cooperation between Obama and the Republicans in Congress may exist. Maybe you can take that discussion a little bit further. If the two sides decide it should be in their interest, as the other panelists have suggested, where do you see as those best opportunities?
Yes, absolutely. I think a good example is the Ryan Murray budget. So, the past 4 years we've seen a lot of gridlock, or past 4 years, we've seen a lot of gridlock. We've seen not a lot of compromise. It's just constant butting heads, and the American people aren't happy. One thing that I thought was very positive was Patty Murray and Paul Ryan, who are very ideologically different in two separate parties, came together and brought forward a budget. And I think if we see the Republican House and Senate do that with President Obama, if they prove to govern, like Mr. Portantino said, Mr. Russo said, I think that will look very well for them for 2016. 4 years ago, I was at an election night party, and it was in 2010 when Republicans had a sweep. And someone told me, I think it's just going to go back and forth every year. And I thought, maybe I don't know about that. And then obviously 2012 happened, and now here's 2014. Now, we can't say that's going to happen again in 2016. I think it all depends on how Republicans govern in the House and Senate and how President Obama chooses to govern in the White House.
Thanks, Jordan. Now, let me ask, let's take this conversation in a slightly different direction. Alec, you talked earlier, I think, and laid out a very helpful picture on the differences between California politically versus the rest of the nation. But one of the things I know you've also spent a lot of time thinking about is the differences between the turnout, and therefore often the outcomes, in midterm elections like yesterday's versus presidential campaigns. And so I wonder if you could talk for a little minute about what that difference in turnout means, both in terms of the number of voters that turn out on Election Day and the composition of the electorate.
Well, historically, Democrats have had a really strong turnout operation, but for some reason this year, we did not have that. And while the percentage of the voters who were supporting each candidate didn't change much, the problem was the Democratic base of Hispanics, African Americans, and young voters didn't come out as strong as it did in 2012 as it did in this year. I mean, it didn't come out as strong as this year as it did in 2012. And I think that definitely shows how the Democrats need to work on bringing their base out in all years, not just presidential years. And I think the way to do that is you really have to play to them a little bit more, because I think during this election we had some issues actually with candidates who were a little too far into the mold, which is definitely important when you have like races where it's more Republicans than Democrats, but at the same time you have to make sure you keep your saints, or as I call the base voters. I stole it from Dan, by the way. But one example is Kentucky, where the Democratic candidate was actually doing pretty well until she wouldn't admit who she voted for in the presidential election. And I think that caused a lot of voters to not view her as genuine or real, even though she was trying to win over moderates who may have not approved of the president, but would be interested in voting for her. And at the same time, I think we have a good turnout operation, but we didn't have anything to motivate our voters with. Back in 2012, we were aggressive when we campaigned. We were not like far left, we don't have to be that, but we just have to be aggressive when we campaign. And I think in this year we weren't as aggressive. We didn't have a clear theme or message, which I think in 2012 we did. I think the way to get our turnout back is not just have a good organization, we already have that. We have to have a really clear message, we have to have a really clear reason to our base why they should vote, because as I showed in 2014, they needed a good reason to vote. And that's not just a good organization.
We're going to turn the conversation from 2014 to the 2016 presidential election in just a minute. But before we do, if I can take just a moment for moderator's prerogative to follow up on a point that Alec made, because I think it's a really, really important one. There's no question that in recent years, the Democrats have had a superior turnout organization for their base. It's something that they'd worked very hard on for many years and did very effectively, certainly in the president's two successful election campaigns in 2008 and 2012. That said, I think it's important to remember that in the broader context of a campaign, a turnout operation is sort of like a field goal in a close football game. It can make a difference in a close election, but it's not fundamentally going to change the outcome. And I think what Alec was talking about a moment ago, and he was being very polite about it, was that the Democrats' challenge, at least at the national level this year, was that their superior turnout organization was no match for just the greater level of motivation on the part of Republican voters this year than Democrats. Just like 8 years ago in the 6th year of George W. Bush's term, Democrats were a lot more motivated than Republicans. So turnout organization matters, but voters who are on the natural very motivated, matters a lot more. So before we come to your guys' questions, let's turn the discussion to 2016. Based on what you saw last night, Anthony, how does this impact your early read on the 2016 presidential campaign?
Well, I think you have to, at this point, say that the Republican tide has the potential to have legs. Obviously, the Republican contenders for the nomination are going to do the talk show circuit for the next 6 months. They're all going to, position themselves as being relevant to the outcome, and will increase their profile. Pundits and interests like to be with the winner, and I think there's going to be a lot of people who are going to think there's momentum. On the Democratic side, you already heard this morning most of the Democratic leaders saying, okay, Republicans, you no longer can be the party of no. Now you have to be for something, and we'd like to see what you're for. And so I think there's going to be some baiting of, okay, you now have cards, play them. And there's going to be a criticism or an opportunity to say, okay, if they put a budget on the table, is that budget truly create jobs? Does it help the safety net? Does it cut education? Does it increase education? With responsibility and authority, you have to make decisions. And so I think the Democrats are going to look at those decisions and dissect them. And I think the Republican presidential positioners are going to try to create a wave and position themselves to be the nominee. So at this point, I think the momentum certainly is on the Republican side, but I think there's opportunity for the Democrats to pick and choose and to be compromisers where it's warranted, but also, say, show us the goods.
Tony, I'm going to come to you with the same question. What do you think that Republicans should take away from this election, and how can they sort of give this wave legs, as Anthony mentioned?
Well, I would look at it from two perspectives. First, the national perspective and the state perspective. Nationally, Republicans have to prove they can govern. And then I think there's a platform for Republican candidates for president to actually be successful. We have to be careful, though, that we don't repeat what happened in 2012, which is 25 or 30 debates, put every possible candidate on the podium, and destroy each of the potential candidates before the campaign even gets started. So I think that's going to be a challenge for Republicans, and as Anthony said, you already have all of these different Republicans doing the circuit, taking credit for it. Rightfully so, Christie was chairman of the Republican Governors Association, but you're going to see all kinds of candidates emerge now. From a state perspective, I think we have to be careful not to overreach. I mean, there is no way a Republican candidate for president is going to win the state of California. It's just not going to happen. Despite seeing some encouraging trends this election, it just doesn't, it's not going to happen. The voter registration won't allow it, demographics won't allow it. And so the real question in California is, will Republicans be able to hold on to the gains they made in this election and not lose them in a significantly higher turnout election?
Okay, so very helpful broader perspective from both Anthony and Tony on what to look for in the 2016 presidential campaign. But I want names. So first Alec and then Jordan. Who should we be looking at in your respective parties as candidates to keep an eye on and as potential nominees? Alec, we'll start with you. I've heard rumors that the former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton is potentially considering a run for president. How do you see the Democratic primary unfolding?
Well, Hillary is not officially announced, but as my mother always said, if Hillary Clinton is breathing, Hillary Clinton is running. So I tend to agree with her on that, and I'm looking forward to see Hillary announce in the next couple of months that she'll be running, because she said, I'm going to make my decision by the end of the year or by early next year, and you usually don't announce you're not running that early. So I think she's definitely going to run. And there are definitely some people who could potentially run against her. I mean, in 2007, we probably all thought Hillary was the inevitable Democratic nominee, but I'd like to point out a few differences from then and now. Back then, Hillary wasn't as inevitable. Like right now, I don't know, she's like 70% in the polls or something. I think Hillary was a lot lower then, but at the same time, she had a lot more national exposure, a lot more experience. So I think people were definitely willing to elect her, and there's definitely some people who could still run, though. Elizabeth Warren's a potential candidate. She was originally not interested, but she's been making true statements that imply she's at least considering it. Well, I definitely could see her making a play for the progressives. I don't really see Hillary losing to her because Elizabeth Warren, I think, has a bit of a limited appeal, while President Obama, when he ran against her in 2008, had a bit of a broader appeal than Warren did. And Joe Biden, I just don't think is popular enough to attack her and beat her, so I see her running. And also, she was doing a lot of campaigning from the 2014 campaign to another big sign that she's running, because if these candidates win, she wants to make sure that they'll be supporting her during the primary and will be superdelegates in case the convention comes down to that. Superdelegates for her.
Okay. So Jordan, we're not going to ask you to endorse a Republican candidate for president, but what should we be keeping an eye on as that field comes together?
Oh, I mean, I think the difference between the Republican Party and Democrat Party, it's pretty obvious. Hillary Clinton is the defined Democrat candidate. I mean, she is most likely going to be the candidate. As Alex said, we thought she was going to be the candidate in 2007, and that didn't work out, but I don't think that'll happen again. I think she'll certainly, if she runs, which she probably will run, will be the Democrat nominee in 2016. But for the Republicans, there's not a real defined candidate. There's not really one guy that everybody's rallying behind. And traditionally, we've always kind of had that, and we really just don't have that this time. Like Mr. Russo mentioned, there's many different waves in the Republican Party. You've got the Tea Party, you've got Libertarian Republicans, you've got the more traditional Republicans. There's so many different waves, so there's so many different people backing all sorts of different candidates. To drop some names, I think Senator Paul is a much more serious candidate than his father. He appeals to a wider range of people. He's not as libertarian as his father, so I think you could see him in contention. He's reaching out to groups that Republicans haven't traditionally reached out to, different minority groups. He's doing a really good job of reaching out to women. I think Senator Marco Rubio, you might see him throw his hat in the ring, and he won't throw his hat in the ring if you see Jeb Bush run. A lot of people are thinking Jeb Bush might run. He's being talked about quite a bit. There are some people who are concerned about that with the Bush name not being very popular. I think we can see Paul Ryan might run. I'm not 100%, but you might see him run. You might see Susana Martinez run. She's been talked about quite a bit. I think another one, too, that a lot of people, in 2012 never would have saw happening, and he continues to deny it, is Governor Mitt Romney. In 2012, his campaign didn't do a great job at showing him as a person. Democrats were able to portray him as a CEO that didn't care about anybody and only cared about the very rich. And so many things that have happened between now and Election Day 2012 that his popularity has kind of skyrocketed. You had that documentary where you saw Mitt Romney, the family man. You saw him as a person. All the predictions that Governor Romney made in 2012, for the most part, came true, whether it's foreign policy, whether it's the Affordable Care Act, whether it's the government shutdown. A lot of things he said came true. So he's actually very popular now. And I don't think you'll see a Romney come back, but a lot of donors are pushing it, a lot of people are pushing it, and if he gets enough to push it, you just might see it happen. And if he does run, I think he would be the nominee.
So let's do this. At this point, we're going to open up to questions from all of you. Before we do, just two quick things. Number one, I need to note something that most of you have noticed, that while we strive for an ideological and a partisan diversity on our panels, we usually strive for a demographic diversity as well. And today's panel appears to be a little bit heavier on the testosterone than we normally do. But for those of you who are coming for the first time, rest assured that we really do include and encourage female panelists as well. It's just a luck of the draw, for good or bad, that that's not the case this week. But please don't draw a broader lesson from it. Before we go to questions from all of you, just two quick reminders that many of you have heard me offer before. If you have a question, raise your hand, and when I call on you, tell us who you are so we know who's entering the conversation. And second, if you're going to ask a question of somebody on the panel with whom you disagree, remember that person's not your enemy. That's somebody who cares just as much about these things as you do and happens to have come to a different conclusion than you have. And we ask that you approach them and question them with the same respect and regard that you'd hope that they would show you if they were questioning you. So with that, who might have a question for our panelists?
I think the Tea Party will continue to exist. I don't think it will define the debate inside the Republican Party as much as it did in past elections. And I think you'll see still a concerted effort by certain groups to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Other panelists' thoughts on the Tea Party?
Yeah, if I could add to that, I think you saw with Senator Ted Cruz, and I guess it wasn't technically a filibuster, but his filibuster, that was not good for the Republican Party. I think we took a lot of hits from that, and I think now that Republicans control the Senate, you may not see that as much or at all. At least I hope you won't see it at all.
Other questions from the audience? Yes. Yep, you.
Well, I think fiscally, if you look at the Democrat Party, just like we said with Republicans, there's different segments. There's a business-friendly, more moderate Democrat constituency, and there's a more liberal or progressive, more public employee union-oriented constituency. And as I sort of alluded to earlier, the public employee unions have designs on rather significant increases in revenue. And the way they get there is they look at the recession. And if you look at the government spending line and what the rate of growth was before the recession hit, and if you were to extrapolate that line out to today, public employee unions believe the state should be spending about $21 billion more today than they are. And so how do you get there? You either grow the economy, but that isn't really necessarily the place they look to do that. So they look for tax increases. And we've already heard that the unions would like to go to the ballot. They would have liked to have done it if they had 2/3 control of the legislature, although I'm not sure moderate Democrats would vote to put tax hikes on the ballot. But we know that they plan to go to signature gathering by next summer. And what we're anticipating and hearing is a split roll property tax. So you take Prop 13 and break it up and say commercial property gets reassessed annually, homeowners don't. That raises about $6 to $8 billion. An oil severance tax, which raises about $4 billion. A tobacco tax that raises about $1 billion. The extension of the Prop 30 high-income earner taxes, which could generate $6 billion. All of a sudden, you see a path that there really is a way to get there. And given the demographics and voter turnout in a general presidential election, if you can replicate what you did in 2012, there's a path to pass some of these. And so I think this governor has been very conservative on spending, so he's going to frustrate those ambitions, and it's going to go to a ballot fight. And I think it will be in 2016 because the unions won't want to wait until 2020. Now you've got a low turnout gubernatorial election again. They want to take advantage of presidential turnout. So I do think the 16 ballot in California is going to be defined all about revenue.
Anthony, let me bring you into this conversation. We've talked a little bit about the tensions within the Republican Party between the Tea Party and the more mainstream components of the party. What Tony just said here very, very politely is that there's two Democratic parties as well. And I know this is something you've spent a lot of time thinking about. Maybe you can talk about how those two components within the Democratic Party reconcile either at the state or at the national level.
Well, I think most people recognize that there are needs in our state. Education, funding, infrastructure. We saw the water bond pass significantly. We saw Prop 30 pass 2 years ago with a higher percentage than people had anticipated. I think Tony's right in a sense that there's a frustration because we haven't seen a long-term plan. I mean, if you go back to Governor Brown's father, you know, he defined a vision for the state of California. He defined the master plan for higher education. There was what do we want California to look like, and then how are we going to pay for it? And I think the push and the pull within the Democratic Party is going to be the current Governor Brown is going to want to have his vision of what he thinks California should look like when he leaves office. And then there are some other Democrats who are going to have their vision. I think Governor Brown wins the conversation because I think, going back to what I said earlier, people want to be around success. And Governor Brown's leadership has proved to be successful. You know, if you remember, Governor Schwarzenegger tried to raise taxes on the ballot, and they failed. There was a Republican governor pushing tax increases that didn't succeed. Democratic governor pushed it and it succeeded. So I think that conversation will happen, but I tend to think it's going to be more driven by education and infrastructure than a labor conversation, but I think that's also a labor conversation. Infrastructure creates jobs. So I think education, jobs, and infrastructure are going to be the outcome of the Democratic internal conversation, and I think the extension of Prop 30. The education community is very concerned that when Governor Brown leaves office, Prop 30 is set to expire, the tax increases there. So I think you're going to see most of the focus end up at extending Prop 30, education, infrastructure, jobs.
Other questions from the audience? Yes. Well, open question for the panel. All of you, in one way or another, talked about the benefits of the two parties finding ways to work together. Is immigration an issue on which there is potential for bipartisan cooperation? Or given the divisions that have existed between the president and the Republicans in Congress, would they be better off looking in another direction?
Do you want me to go first? Yeah. Well, it's a very good question. I hope that's not where the Republicans start, because I think that will be the most difficult ground to forge to strike a compromise. I think there's a compromise there to the point earlier about the U.S. Chamber stepping up and trying to redefine primaries. To a large degree, the U.S. Chamber is a big supporter of immigration reform. The problem with immigration reform leading with it is just so divisive. It divides the Republican Party. You're going to have Cruz and others go crazy and try to pull and splinter the party. Obama, I think, will be less likely to want to move to the center to get something done because of his own constituencies. And so I think it's probably the worst issue to start. But if, in fact, progress is made on a number of other issues, I think there's clearly a plan, and the plan that McCain and others had put forward earlier in the Congress is probably a very good place to start.
Other thoughts from the panelists on the prospect for immigration reform in Congress this year or next? Or next year or the year after?
It was one thing I was, again, watching the pundits this morning, there was a lot of speculation on whether President Obama will move unilaterally and use executive order to fulfill some of the campaign promises that he made on immigration reform. To me, that's a fascinating question. Does he wait to see what the Republicans do and counter a proposal, or does he seize the momentum? I don't know what he's going to do, but I think that's a fascinating piece of the puzzle to see who moves first, or do they both take a more pragmatic approach that Tony talked about. So I think there's going to be a lot of speculation and a lot of gamesmanship, unfortunately, gamesmanship on a very serious issue that the federal government hasn't dealt with in 100 years.
Alec, I'd like to ask you a related and totally unfair question, if that's okay.
I'm game.
Okay. You said earlier that you thought that one of the challenges for the Democratic Party in this election was that their base wasn't as motivated as they had been in past years. Now, earlier this fall, the White House announced that President Obama would not sign an executive order providing legal residency for a much larger number of undocumented immigrants, and although they didn't say so, it was commonly understood that his reason for delaying the signing of that executive order was so as not to endanger more moderate and conservative Democrats in the South and in the Great Plains states. Do you think if President Obama had signed that executive order on immigration, broadening legalization, do you think that your party's base would have been more motivated? Totally unfair question.
That's okay, I'll answer it. I think it actually would have helped a little bit because while President Obama the Democrats didn't see Hispanics vote for the Republican Party, they did see a lot of Hispanic turnout just drop, and Hispanic turnout was really crucial for Democrats in states like Colorado where they lost a Senate seat. We're probably going to keep the governorship there, but we should have won the Senate seat, and I think the reason we didn't is that there's just not high enough Hispanic turnout there. And if President Obama had signed the executive order, I think it definitely would have helped a bit. Maybe would it have saved Colorado? I don't really know the answer to that question, but I think it definitely would have helped. It would have definitely helped in Nevada, which had really bad Democratic turnout, and lost his house that we had no business losing at all. So I think President Obama should have done it again, as I said earlier. We have a really good turnout operation. I think it's going to be really useful for us in 2016, but if we don't really have a base motivated and we need like a little nudge turnout, we are not going to be able to use our turnout operation effectively. So I think we should have been a lot more aggressive in recording the Hispanic vote, and the immigration definitely would have helped a bit.
I'm sorry, tell me your name again. Marissa, I think it's a great question also, and I'd offer you this just on top of what the panel had to say. As those of you know who come to our programs before, you know that I don't like making predictions because I'm usually wrong. I thought the Trojans were going to go undefeated and win the national championship in football this year, so that's why I don't make predictions. But I will make you, but I will tell you that this is something that I think is at least a prospect for happening in Washington. From everything I've read and heard, the Republicans will seriously consider forwarding an immigration reform proposal. If they do, it will almost certainly not include a pathway to citizenship. Perhaps some other types of legal status, but not a pathway to citizenship for those currently without documentation. And then I think the question for the president is, what do you do if that bill comes to your desk? It's immigration reform. It represents a significant step forward, but it's not everything you've asked for. Do you sign the bill and allow for some progress? Or do you veto it because it doesn't accomplish what you believe to be the most important component of the legislation? And if that does happen to me, it's going to be a fascinating thing to watch. That wasn't a prediction. Yes?
Yeah, I think that's actually an excellent question. I think a big problem with the Republican Party is that we don't go into certain communities. We've always just kind of thought, oh, well, they're not going to vote for us, we shouldn't go in there. Oh, they're not going to vote for us, we shouldn't go in there. And actually in the 2012 presidential election, you saw that, and Paul Ryan and his people, when he was on the Romney campaign, actually suggested that they go to inner cities and start to campaign and start to go out for that vote. But the higher-ups in the Romney campaign said they didn't want to do that. If they had done that, and the 47% comment didn't happen, I think there's a chance we might have a President Romney now, because here's what happens. And to get back to Rand Paul doing this, he's showing that the Republican Party cares about everybody. He's just knocking on doors, he's going to this community. And I think not only it will scrape off, I don't think we'll get a lot of votes in that community, but I think we'll get certainly more, and especially over time, in that community than we have now. And I think more moderate voters that aren't a part of those communities will see that and they'll say, this is a party that really cares. And I think we'll get more votes overall from that. I think a perfect example of this on a smaller level and a more isolated level was Andy Vidic. He's a state senator in Central California in a highly Latino district. And he's a white male, and all he did was go and knock on doors. He went to the different events and it was a highly Latino district. He went to the different communities there. He attended their parties, and he won. He won a special election. He was re-elected last night. So if you just go in these communities, you can make a difference. And I think Senator Paul doing that is really not only helpful to his campaign, but helpful to the Republican Party. And I'm not saying he's going to make a huge difference to starting off, but I think it lays the groundwork and the foundation for something, for a much bigger picture that can happen in the future.
Other panelists on this question?
I totally agree with what you said. I think Rand Paul has the potential to be sort of a transformative candidate for Republicans. He's sort of a rock star. I mean, he came through the state a couple weeks ago. Huge turnout. Both donors want to meet him, voters want to meet him. He sort of redefines the Republican Party, almost like a Teddy Roosevelt redefined the party at one point. The question is he a viable presidential candidate? He's definitely in the running. I just don't know if sort of the institutions inside the Republican Party are prepared to go there yet. We tend to always go with a more established, boring person who's put in their due. If Romney were to get in, I think he wins just because he's done it twice. He's got the infrastructure. Bush will have a massive infrastructure if he gets in. Perry's built an infrastructure over the last year. So we're going to see a very interesting, I think, presidential primary on the Republican side. But we need candidates like Rand Paul to transform the party and pull the others along the way. To your comment about Romney not wanting to do that, all of our candidates need to want to do that.
The more established, boring candidate. That's quite a bumper sticker for the party going forward. Huh?
Anthony, it's interesting that, my name is Luke Phillips, I'm a junior.
Exactly the way I would describe it, Luke. Go ahead.
So that you like it. In that even though
I don't see a progressive emerging today. And my comment was about how if you look at the field today, I don't know that a very or progressive Republican, I'm not so sure who that. Anytime a Republican starts to get out there just a little too chance that the right comes in and slaps him down. Remember Perry's comment on immigration. I think that hurt him more getting the third department he wanted to close. Core issue of the Republican Party. Republican candidates have to walk a fine line. I think Rand Paul is doing that, of covering off the base, but moving to the center in a way that attracts new voters to the party.
All right, both Anshu and I have several additional questions to ask, and I know that there's other people here in the audience who have additional questions as well. Unfortunately, though, we're just about out of time. And so in just a moment, I'm going to ask you to thank our panelists. But before I do, just a few quick announcements. Even though this is our last Students Talk back of the semester, there still is additional political programming that might be of interest to you. Tomorrow at noon, as a matter of fact, in VKC 300A, Professor Bob Shrum is hosting a conversation on this week's elections and what comes next. That's tomorrow at noon in VKC 300A. And for those of you who haven't heard Professor Shrum yet, he's an extraordinarily well-respected and experienced Democratic political consultant for many, many years. And he's led a series of fascinating conversations. So if you're around for lunch tomorrow, that'd be a great thing to hear. Second, a week from tonight, on November 12th, for those of you who are interested in the state politics, particularly in the outcome of last night's governor's race, we're hosting a post-election dinner, those of us at the Unruh Institute, and we're bringing in as special guests both Aaron McClear, who is the chief strategist and senior advisor for Neil Kashgari's campaign, and Ace Smith, who is the senior consultant and chief advisor for Governor Brown's campaign. So we'll be having a panel discussion with them, with two student panelists as well. That's a week from tonight at 6:30 at the University Club. Now, seating's limited for that dinner, so if you're interested, you need to RSVP through the Unruh Institute. But we think it'll be a very interesting conversation. We did one similar 2 years ago with senior strategists for the Romney and Obama campaign. We think this one will be just as good. And then finally, I know it's way too early to be thinking about spring semester, but for those of you who may be interested in doing an internship in politics, government, or in a similarly related field in the spring semester, we at the Unruh Institute are already beginning to meet with students and help them find internships for spring. So come by VKC 263, and Jody Epstein and her team are more than happy to help you in any way they can. So that's it for the announcements. So first of all then, join me in thanking Anshu Siripurapu, the news editor of the Daily Trojan, for joining me today as co-moderator. Anshu, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Let's thank our panelists. Let's thank Anthony Portantino, Tony Russo, Jordan Tygh, and Alec White for a fascinating conversation. Guys, we really appreciate it. And thanks finally to the entire team at the Unruh Institute for putting on these programs throughout the semester. So thank you, Jody, thank you, Tanya, thank you, Kirsten, thank you, Alyssa, and especially thanks to Laura Hill for the great work they've done, not just today, but all semester, in putting together these programs for all of you guys. Thank you very, very much. And finally, thanks to all of you for attending. We'll hopefully see you either at Professor Shrum's conversation tomorrow, at our post-election dinner next week, or certainly in spring semester when the Students Talk Back series continues. Have a great day.